And now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Andrew Edwards, who would like to speak to regarding the Savanna Monitoring and Evaluation Framework, which I mentioned earlier on, fondly known as the SMERF. Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, thanks, Desiree. I've been funded by the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC for a few years. And one of the projects we've been lucky enough to get up through them and a number of other partners, which I'll try and explain here with this slide, is this Savanna Monitoring and Evaluation Reporting Framework that we've been calling SMERF. It grew out of a lot of work that was done by a lot of other people. So that bunch of logos on the left there, the Kimberley Land Council, Kakadu National Park, that logo in the middle is the Parks and Wildlife Service of Western Australia. Colleagues in the north up there were doing, Ben Corey, we're doing monitoring and evaluation reporting, mostly based on the NAFI data. And then there was the West Arnhem Land Fire Abatement Project. There was a lot of spatial analysis of data that was using higher resolution fire mapping. But again, this monitoring and evaluation reporting. And of course, we worked very closely with Bushfires NT. We were part of Bushfires NT for a very long time. And we produced a lot of monitoring and evaluation reports of the fire metrics, which I'll detail a little bit later. The funders are that group in the middle. So the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC have primarily funded this program, but we had an initial injection of funds from Queensland Parks and Wildlife, and that was for a program to look at all these various metrics, which I'll get to again. I'll talk about later, but to see how appropriate they were to use for biodiversity assessment, so for monitoring and evaluation. And then, of course, more recently, we've had this project with Parks and Wildlife in the NT, who one of the poorest organisations I've ever met, and they were able to find a little bit of money to help us do a further evaluation where we've looked at properties at a finer detail. So instead of looking at property scale assessments, we're looking at fire community scales. So we're able to redo some mapping, and I'll illustrate that a bit later to show you how that works. And then those of us who have put it together, there's us, Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research. We're based at the Research Institute for Environment and Livelihoods here at Charles Darwin University. So I acknowledge all of those groups. And then there's my colleague, Aidan Joseph, who works for FNQ Spatial Data Services. He's a contractor to NAFI. And of course, the banner, I've got NAFI, the banner for that up on top, just because everything, all of these data, all of these metrics, all of this reporting is completely underpinned by the data produced by my colleagues, Rowan, who's in the room, and Aidan, who's the fellow I just referred to, who sits in Cairns, and of course, Peter Jacklin, the manager of NAFI, who also sits in Cairns. So there's a lot of collaborators, a lot of people, there's a lot of information. And then the team that I work with on SMERF, who, you know, it's not been an easy road. There's a lot of work to do on databasing, and my very clever colleague, Dr. Patrice Weber, he's in the room too. He manages all the data, all the databasing, and does all this very, very clever programming. He's a software engineer. I've got Ashish, who's in the room, who does all of the JavaScripting for our front ends, which I'll demonstrate to you later. I've got Kerry. She's in the room too. Kerry has been doing all the work with Parks and Wildlife in the last few months. And there's me, who just sort of talks about it. So I'm going to give you I've given you a bit of a brief outline. I'm going to talk about some of the common examples of fire management goals that people want to use these metrics for. I mean, why have we created this system? And then I'll give you some examples of what's going on. So as I said, all of the data are underpinned by NAFI. This is a screenshot from 7:30 this morning or something, some hideous hour I was up making this presentation. There's the web address there, www.firenorth.org.au. Peter Jacklin will be talking about NAFI next up. But as you can see, it's a fairly extensive amount of data, and it's, you know, that's just a quick snapshot, and that's what most people want to see. They just want to see this image, zoom into a place and go, are there any hotspots? Is there any fire mapping? Bang, and they're out of there. That's probably 99% of users. Then there's a whole lot of other stuff that sits behind, historical mapping and tools for looking at hotspot progression through the landscape, and a whole lot of other things like that. Enormous tool. Here's an example again from this morning of what's happening. So you can see all the colours across the landscape. So this is the Kimberley, for those of you who might be watching from WA, and you can see all the different fire scars mapped on here. That would be all done by Rowan for the Kimberley, and you can see the legend there on the right with the months that it occurs. And there are these blue and red spots, and they're the most recent fires. So they're not as accurate as the fire mapping. The fire mapping is like 95% accurate, whereas everything else is, those hotspots are a bit looser. Top End, Cape York. And just out of interest for those who are looking on the line, this area of Cape York is larger than Victoria. So if you're looking at these fire scars here, you can get a sense of the scale. And those fire fronts you can see, like up there near the top of the map, you know, that would be hundreds of kilometres long. So this is the sort of fires we're dealing with today. And do you see anything in the news? So NAFI coverage is pretty extensive. The dark green area in this image is all of the Northern Territory, most of the Kimberley, and the top half of Queensland. And then those lighter green areas are areas that have a more limited coverage. The Queensland coverage is about to be brought back up to date. They've put an injection of funds in to get all of that happening. South Australians just get that area of desert mapped sort of not very frequently because it doesn't burn very frequently. And then we've got the WA rangelands, and this money comes in separately from them for that. Fire management goals. What are we trying to achieve here? So most of our colleagues are working in the north, in the top part of, in the tropical savannas predominantly. And the biggest problem we face here is this very big accumulation of fuel on an annual basis. And within 2 years, you can have enough fuel to have a very destructive wildfire. So the idea is to reduce severe late season wildfires. That's sort of the main issue and the main task. Also, because we can have this high fire frequency, another important thing is to reduce fire frequency, particularly of those wildfires. So that's reducing the amount of area that's burnt every year. So you can start to see how the pitch is starting to build up. We need to stop wildfires, and we need to stop fire frequency. So we need to be very strategic. We need to start increasing a lot of the biodiversity surveys and data that have been produced over the last decades show us that there are many, many species that require quite long unburnt areas. I just read a paper recently about some grass wrens down in the Gulf of Carpentaria area, and they require spinifex that hasn't been burnt for 7 years. I don't know if you've looked at the fire mapping for North Australia, but that's a very rare phenomenon these days. And obviously, we need to reduce the size of any burnt patches because the more extensive something is, the more a single creature's or plant's habitat is completely fire affected, and therefore they've got no food, they've got nowhere to live. So we need to have these small patchiness, and that we need to do through the implementation of early prescribed burning. Predominantly, there are, you know, it's not that simple. It's a very, very complicated thing. I mean, it's not like rocket science at all. It's a lot more complicated. Natural and cultural asset protection is also very, very important. It's probably the first thing that's done by most groups anyway. So what does this mean in terms of fire history? So we've got fire history where we map fires on a near weekly basis. It's sort of collated into months or seasons and years. So we've got this enormous fire history, and with it we can create all of these various metrics. So there's a whole list of them there, and I'll give them a bit more detail later rather than just trying to go through them now. The first is seasonality. So in this background map, you can see green patches and red patches. So this is just an example area somewhere out in Arnhem Land from a couple of years ago. So the green areas are all those fires that occurred in the early dry season, which we presume to be, and a lot of our data supports the idea that these early dry season fires are much more benign. I mean, they're not all still good. You can see some very big patches there. So it's not great, but it's an improvement on those big red things. So the big red ones are the late dry season fires. So that's one metric, the seasonality of fire and how much got burnt. And we can demonstrate that, and we do in these Smurf reports with, this is an example area that Aidan pulled out. You can see it's got a high predominance of late dry season fires, all the red stuff. And then we've got a table that shows all the numbers and a graph that shows the data. And you can see some good and bad years as examples in there. And then we can look at averages over time and how those things have changed. So we can look at how fire management may or may not have improved or not changed at all. And in that Site B example, there was no change. This is Site A. This is an area where a Savanna burning project has been implemented. You can see that through time, those circles, they're sort of the fire history for each year, how it's got less red and more green through time. So there's a lot more work. The graph illustrates that equally. And then we can see that as an annual percent burnt of the project area. And you can see the green bar goes up and up and up through time. Similarly for history. And then fire frequency, as I talked about before, is really important to reduce the frequency of fire so that we've got more longer unburnt areas scattered throughout the landscape as a mosaic. So we can show that metric. Long unburnt patches, as I described, we need longer unburnt patches of various ages, 2, 5 and more years. We know Calitris intratropica cypress pine needs at least 10 years to mature and set seed. So if we don't have that sort of regime in the landscape, we don't have that tree anymore. And similarly for lots of other species. Time since last burnt, that gives us an idea of fuel age, really handy tool for planning, but it also tells us a little bit more detail than just the how much there hasn't been for 2 years or 5 years. So we can do a lot of planning through that. Look for fuel that's maybe 2 or 3 years old and go and burn it more strategically. And then there's this metric called minimum fire interval, and that again refers to species that need time to, plant species in particular, that need time to mature, set seed, and drop that seed back into the habitat. And if they don't have that time, then they go extinct there locally. So this is an important metric that tells you about potential extinctions in your area of interest. Patchiness, we can look at patches, we can look at the average number of patches, the size of patches, the maximum patch size, the minimum patch size, etc. We can do all of these different things. And there's this other quite neat metric that our colleagues at the Australian Wildlife Conservancy came up with, the KLC, and you can see here what this is those colours. So the red means it's much more distant to an unburnt patch. So those pixels in that red area are much further away from the the grey area than the orange, than the yellow, than the green. So it gives you an idea of sort of the patchiness and the mosaic of fire in that landscape for a given year. And you can overlay those through time and look to see, how that's affecting the habitat. It's a very useful metric. So what we did was we compiled all of those metrics with all of the graphs and tables and so forth that come with them, and we produced reports. Because we first worked with Queensland Parks on this, we did a series of, Aidan produced these reports. So that one on the left is Rinuroo, that's Lakefield National Park, if you don't know Rinuroo, up there near Lake, what's that called, Charlotte Bay, and north of Cairns. And so he produced that and we went through that. There were 6 parks and they were all quite different types of parks. There was a heathland park, coastal parks, Savanna, very, very Savanna park. And we worked out that a lot of, what was useful about each of the metrics and how they could be presented as a graph, as a table, etc. And we've produced that report. From that, we then went and did one for a whole lot for NT parks, and just out of interest to get the Western Australians interested, we did Prince Regent as well. So we've had a lot of feedback from lots of people, and this mostly from the parkies, because, well, they're the most interested in biodiversity, as well as there's a lot of Indigenous organisations that are also interested in monitoring and evaluation, and that's all in there. Thank you. Healthy country planning. What I want to do is show you the Smurf dashboard. As I said, Ashish has been doing all the JavaScripting on this. Patrice has done tons of work in the background producing all the databases that go with this. So what we wanted to do was the first version of Smurf was very much like what you've been able to see on NAFI for a long time is InfoNet, and it produced that report that I just showed you that's got all the metrics and everything in it. Absolutely huge report and very useful if you want to look at your history and do some planning. But if you want to look at something really quickly, you want to go and use the dashboard. So here's the dashboard online now, I hope. So you can see on the left here, there's a bunch of metrics that I referred to earlier, fire seasonality, etc. So let's select somewhere just local, Northern Territory. We'll go to Parks and Reserves and we'll look at Nitmaluk, just because I really love Nitmaluk. And it zooms into there. And then you get all of the various metrics appear. You can see the graphs to the right there. The first one shows you for 2019 how much was unburnt, how much was burnt in the early dry season, how much was burnt in the late dry season. And if you hover the mouse over the bars, you can see that value as an area in kilometres squared. So then we can, because this is not a Mac, we can go and look at all the various years. No, it's making a liar of me. Oh, yes, it's going to do it. Okay, so you can go through this. 2016, you can see had a lot of early dry season burning. No, it's being about 2015, 2014. I've just been given time. But anyway, go and play with this. There's the address, smurf.net.au, and I'll stop sharing that and move on. Sorry, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. So if any of you, we still have time to ask Andrew a couple of questions. I've just been told one question. Is anyone from the floor or online have a question? Please raise your hand and we'll be asking this question. We have a roaming mic here in the audience. Otherwise, please put your hand up.
Thanks, Andrew. Smurf looks fantastic. So is it live now? Anyone can access it?
I just showed you the live version.
Right.
Yeah, so it's been live for a little while, but we've been building more and more capacity. Because when we first released it to a whole lot of people, I just sent an email to people and say, here, have a look, tell me what you think. And they went, can we have more metrics? Can we have this? Can you spell all of that, please, correctly? And yeah, we had a few things that we fixed up and we've still been working. It's a work in progress. I think Ashish we've got a little bit of money to keep him on for another 2 or 3 days. So no. And we'll keep working on it. And so if you want to go and have a look, please have a look and email me or any of the other team, and we'll make whatever changes people sort of think is reasonable. Who's next?
All right. Thank you, Andrew.